A weary cyclist is startled when a koala leaps onto their bike. The koala's desperate plea for help leads to a heartwarming outcome. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. The Australian outback stretched endlessly before Jake as he pedaled his mountain bike across the rugged terrain. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the red earth, and the silence was broken only by the crunch of his tires against the dusty ground. His camera, secured to his chest with a harness, bounced gently with each movement. He'd been documenting his journey for the past 3 weeks, capturing the raw beauty of the Australian wilderness. The landscape here was different from anything he'd seen in America. The colors were more intense, deep reds of the earth contrasting sharply with the pale blue sky. Occasional clusters of hardy vegetation dotted the terrain, their muted greens providing the only respite from the dominant rust-colored palette. Jake stopped periodically to adjust his camera settings, ensuring he captured the subtle variations in light and shadow that made the desert so captivating. As he rounded a bend in the makeshift trail, something caught his attention. Among the sparse vegetation, a gray mass huddled against the trunk of a weathered eucalyptus tree. At first, Jake thought it might be a piece of debris carried by the wind, but as he drew closer, his heart rate quickened. The mass moved slightly, and he recognized the distinctive shape of a koala. The animal's condition was immediately concerning. Its fur appeared matted and dull, lacking the healthy sheen typical of these creatures. Its eyes were half closed, and its usual plump appearance seemed deflated. Jake had researched Australian wildlife extensively before his trip, and he knew koalas rarely left their trees unless something was seriously wrong. This one was clearly in distress. Dismounting his bike, Jake reached for his water bottle. He approached slowly, conscious of every movement. While koalas weren't typically aggressive, any wild animal could be unpredictable when stressed. The koala barely acknowledged his presence, a sign that worried him even more. He crouched down, maintaining a respectful distance, and carefully poured some water into the palm of his hand. The sound of children's laughter carried on the wind, and Jake noticed a small group of kids playing near a cluster of rocks about 50 yards away. They had stopped their game and were watching him with curious expressions. Jake remained focused on the koala, which had finally shown interest in his presence. With agonizing slowness, the animal lifted its head. When the koala didn't retreat, Jake inched closer, still holding out his water-filled palm. The animal's eyes fixed on the water, and after what seemed like an eternity, it reached out with a weak paw. The moment the koala made contact with his hand, Jake's chest tightened with emotion. The creature's trust, born of desperate need, struck him deeply. The children had begun creeping closer, their phones already out and recording. Jake heard their whispered exclamations in a mix of English and local slang. The koala, seemingly too weak to be bothered by the additional attention, had settled into Jake's lap after drinking several handfuls of water. Its grip, while not strong, maintained the instinctive clutching behavior typical of its species. "Mister, is it sick?" one of the children called out, her voice carrying a mix of concern and excitement. Jake nodded, keeping his movements minimal to avoid disturbing the animal. "I think it's dehydrated," he replied, his voice automatically lowering to match the hushed atmosphere that had fallen over the scene. "Does anyone know if there's a wildlife expert nearby?" The children were now rapidly typing on their phones, their fingers flying across screens as they documented the scene. "Yeah," could already imagine the social media posts spreading through the local community. In a small Australian town like this, news traveled fast, and a tourist with a distressed koala would definitely qualify as newsworthy. The koala's breathing had steadied somewhat, but Jake could feel the animal's elevated body temperature through his clothes. He knew enough about wildlife to understand that this was just temporary aid. The creature needed professional help. As if in response to his thoughts, the sound of approaching vehicles broke through the morning quiet. The children's documentation of the scene had worked faster than he'd anticipated. Little did Jake know that this unexpected encounter would set in motion a chain of events that would completely reshape his understanding of purpose, community, and identity, starting with the arrival of a certain local biologist who was about to change everything. The scene around Jake and the koala transformed rapidly as news spread through the small town. What had started with a few curious children had evolved into a small crowd, their phones raised like a forest of electronic periscopes. Social media posts tagged with #DesertKoala and #KoalaHero began circulating, drawing more onlookers to the spot where Jake sat, still cradling the weakened animal. The children who had first discovered the scene had appointed themselves unofficial chroniclers of the event. They darted through the growing crowd, providing running commentary and background information to newcomers. "He just found it here," one boy explained enthusiastically to a group of adults. "The koala let him give it water," another child chimed in, showing her phone screen where a video of Jake's initial encounter was already gaining local traction. The impromptu gathering had the feeling of a small festival, with people speaking in hushed but excited tones, careful not to disturb the animal. Some brought water bottles and eucalyptus branches, while others offered blankets and shade umbrellas. The community's response was immediate and heartfelt, though somewhat chaotic in its enthusiasm. A sudden shift in the crowd's energy signaled a new arrival. The sea of onlookers parted to make way for a woman in her early 30s, wearing khaki shorts and a field vest covered in pockets. Her arrival brought an immediate change to the atmosphere. The excited murmurs quieted, and people stepped back respectfully. This was clearly someone the community knew and trusted. "I'm Sarah Mitchell," she announced, approaching Jake with purposeful strides. Her voice carried authority without aggression, and her eyes immediately focused on the koala's condition. "I'm the resident biologist here. Someone tagged me in a post about 10 minutes ago." She crouched down beside Jake, her movements careful and practiced. Sarah's assessment was quick and professional. She checked the koala's eyes, felt its nose for temperature, and observed its breathing pattern. "Severe dehydration," she confirmed, pulling a small medical kit from one of her many pockets. "The hot spell we've been having has been particularly hard on the local wildlife. This one's probably been struggling for days." Jake watched as she worked, noting the efficiency of her movements and the gentle way she handled the animal. "I'm Jake," he offered, still maintaining his position as the koala seemed reluctant to release its grip on his shirt. "I was just biking through when I found it. Is there somewhere we can take it for treatment?" Sarah nodded, already preparing a small hydration solution and a dropper. "We have a rehabilitation center about 20 kilometers from here. It's not large, but it's well equipped for cases like this." She paused, addressing the crowd that had gathered. "Everyone, I know you want to help, but what this koala needs most right now is space. We need to get it to the center as quickly as possible." The crowd's response was immediate and organized, surprising Jake with its efficiency. People began creating a clear path, while others offered their vehicles for transport. Sarah took charge of the situation with practiced ease, directing resources and organizing a small team to assist with the transfer. "The community here is very protective of our wildlife," Sarah explained to Jake as they worked together to prepare the koala for transport. "We've seen too many habitats destroyed, too many animals displaced. Each rescue like this matters more than you might think." Her words carried weight, hinting at larger concerns beneath the surface of this single rescue. As they coordinated their efforts, Jake found himself impressed by Sarah's knowledge and dedication. She explained each step of the process, from proper handling techniques to the immediate care the koala would need. Her passion for wildlife conservation was evident in every word and action. The children who had first spread the news were now helping to gather supplies, their earlier excitement channeled into purposeful activity. "Miss Sarah," one of them called out, "can we come to the center to check on it later?" Sarah smiled, revealing a softer side beneath her professional demeanor. "Let's get our friends stable first," she replied, "but I think we can arrange some supervised visits. This could be a good opportunity for everyone to learn more about wildlife conservation." The mention of conservation caused something to flicker across Sarah's face, a brief shadow of concern that Jake noticed but couldn't yet understand. As they prepared to transport the koala, the atmosphere shifted from excited discovery to focused determination. Something bigger was brewing beneath the surface of this rescue, something that would soon draw both Jake and Sarah into a challenge neither of them had anticipated. The groundwork was being laid for a movement that would transform not just a single koala's fate, but the future of the entire community. And at the center of it all, two strangers were about to discover that their chance meeting would catalyze changes neither could have predicted. The transformation of the small Australian town happened with remarkable speed. Within hours of the koala's discovery, what had started as a roadside rescue evolved into a full-scale community initiative. The local community center, typically quiet on weekdays, buzzed with activity as residents streamed in and out, carrying supplies and sharing ideas. Jake found himself at the center of this whirlwind of activity, working alongside Sarah to coordinate the sudden influx of support. They had set up an impromptu command center in the community center's main room, where a large whiteboard now displayed lists of needed supplies and planned activities. The koala, safely transported to the rehabilitation center, had become a symbol for something larger than itself. "We need to be strategic about this," Sarah explained, marking up the whiteboard with precise handwriting. "The rehabilitation center needs specific supplies, medical equipment, specialized food, and proper bedding." She turned to address the growing group of volunteers. "But more importantly, we need to raise awareness about why we're finding dehydrated koalas in the first place." Jake, who had expected to continue his solitary bicycle journey, instead found himself designing posters on his laptop. His background in photography proved unexpectedly useful as he sorted through the pictures he'd taken earlier, selecting images that would resonate with potential donors. The sight of the weakened koala in the desert had struck a chord with him, and he was determined to translate that emotional impact into his work. The local children, still excited from their role in the morning's events, had appointed themselves official messengers. They darted between groups of adults, carrying updates and messages, their energy infectious. Several of them clustered around Jake's laptop, offering surprisingly insightful suggestions about which images might work best for their community. "Miss Sarah always says we need to show people why they should care," one girl explained, pointing to a particularly poignant image of the koala reaching for water. "This one shows how much they need our help." Sarah, overhearing the comment, paused in her organization efforts. "That's right, Emma," she confirmed, coming over to look at the images. "And speaking of showing why we should care," she hesitated for a moment before continuing, "I've been documenting wildlife rescues in this area for the past 5 years. Would you like to see some of that footage, Jake? It might help with the campaign." The next hour revealed a side of Sarah that transformed Jake's understanding of the situation. Her documentation was thorough and professional. Hundreds of rescue operations, rehabilitation efforts, and release campaigns. But it was more than just a record of events. Through her lens, Jake saw the pattern of environmental change that had led to today's rescue. "It started with my grandfather," Sarah explained as they reviewed the footage. "He was one of the first wildlife conservationists in this area. When he passed away, he left me his research journals, decades of observations about local wildlife patterns." Her voice carried a mix of pride and concern. "The changes we're seeing now, they're unprecedented. The koala we found today isn't an isolated case." The community center had become a hub of activity. People brought in food for the volunteers. Local businesses offered to sponsor various aspects of the fundraising event, and someone had even started a social media campaign that was gaining traction beyond their small town. Jake found himself impressed by the efficiency with which everything came together. "We've had practice," Sarah admitted when he commented on it. "This community has faced its share of environmental challenges. We've learned to mobilize quickly." She paused, studying a map of recent wildlife sightings. "But this time feels different. Having someone from outside notice and care, it adds weight to what we've been saying all along." As the day progressed, Jake and Sarah fell into an easy rhythm of collaboration. They moved between tasks seamlessly, anticipating each other's needs and building on each other's ideas. The fundraising event was taking shape. They planned activities that would educate as well as entertain, ensuring that the message of conservation remained central to the celebration. Late in the afternoon, Sarah shared more details about her previous rescue operations. Each story revealed not just her dedication to wildlife conservation, but also her deep connection to the land and its inhabitants. Jake found himself drawn in by her passion, recognizing in her the same drive for purpose that had led him to embark on his solitary journey across Australia. "You know," Sarah said as they finalized the event schedule, "when I first got tagged in those posts this morning, I thought it would be just another rescue operation. But something feels different about this one." She looked at Jake thoughtfully. "Maybe it's because you're here, an outsider who chose to stop and help. It's making people pay attention in a way they haven't before." What neither of them realized yet was that this day of planning and preparation was laying the groundwork for much more than a single fundraising event. The connection forming between them, built on shared purpose and mutual respect, would soon be tested by challenges that would require every bit of their combined strength and determination. As the sun set on their first day of planning, the community center gradually emptied, leaving Jake and Sarah surrounded by the evidence of their day's work: posters, schedules, and lists that would guide their next steps. Neither spoke about the fact that Jake had completely abandoned his Origina travel plans. Some decisions don't need to be verbalized to be understood. The local park transformed into a festival ground under the bright Australian sun. Colorful banners featuring the rescued koala's image fluttered in the warm breeze, and information booths lined the winding paths. The turnout exceeded everyone's expectations. It seemed the entire town had emerged to support the cause, along with visitors from neighboring communities who had seen the viral posts. Children darted between activity stations, their faces painted with koala designs, while parents studied the educational displays Sarah had meticulously prepared. Each booth told part of a larger story: the history of local wildlife, the impact of climate change, and the increasing frequency of animal rescues in the area. The message was clear without being heavy-handed. Their local ecosystem was in crisis. Jake found himself at the center stage area, adjusting the microphone setup. He hadn't planned to speak publicly, but Sarah had insisted. "Your perspective matters," she told him that morning. "You saw our situation with fresh eyes. Sometimes it takes an outsider to help people see what's right in front of them." Now, watching the crowd gather, he felt the weight of that responsibility. The festival atmosphere carried an underlying current of purpose. Between the face-painting stations and wildlife-themed games, serious conversations were taking place. Local environmental experts, invited by Sarah, engaged with community members about conservation efforts. Maps displayed the shrinking wildlife corridors, and photographs documented the changing landscape over decades. "Ready?" Sarah appeared beside Jake, carrying a tablet with their presentation slides. She'd spent the previous evening helping him prepare his speech, offering insights about the community and its history. "Remember, just speak from your heart. That's what reached people when you first found the koala." Jake nodded, scanning the growing crowd. He recognized faces now: the children who'd first discovered him with the koala, the shop owners who'd donated supplies, the elderly couple who'd shared stories of how the landscape had changed during their lifetime. In just a few days, he'd become unexpectedly connected to this community and its struggles. As he stepped up to the microphone, a hush fell over the gathered crowd. Jake took a deep breath and began speaking, his voice steady despite his nerves. "3 days ago, I was just passing through your town. I'm a traveler, a photographer, someone who documents places and moves on. But something happened here that made me stop." He gestured to the large screen behind him, where his photo of the dehydrated koala appeared. "This moment changed something for me. It wasn't just about helping one animal. It was about understanding that sometimes we're called to stop running and start fighting for something bigger than ourselves." The crowd listened intently as Jake shared his observations about their community's response to the crisis. He spoke about the immediate mobilization, the shared purpose he'd witnessed, and the deeper issues that the koala's rescue had brought to light. With each word, he felt more certain about his decision to stay and help. From her position near the stage, Sarah watched Jake's speech with growing admiration. She'd worked for years to raise awareness about local environmental issues, but something about Jake's outsider perspective was reaching people in a new way. She noticed heads nodding in agreement, saw people leaning in to listen more closely. "Your community has shown me what it means to come together for a cause," Jake continued, his voice growing more passionate. "But from what I've learned in the past few days, this is just the beginning of a larger fight. The koala we rescued isn't just one animal in distress. It's a warning sign we can't ignore. The impact of his words was visible in the crowd's response. People who had come for a casual community event were now engaged in serious discussion. Parents pulled their children closer, listening to explanations about habitat preservation. Local business owners huddled together, discussing ways to make their practices more environmentally conscious. As Jake concluded his speech, the applause was more than just polite. It carried the energy of people who had been moved to action. Sarah stepped forward to take the microphone, building on the momentum Jake had created. Together, they presented the data she'd collected over years, now framed within the context of immediate, necessary action. Throughout the rest of the event, Jake noticed a shift in the atmosphere. What had started as a fundraiser had evolved into something more significant, a catalyst for change. People weren't just participating in activities. They were making commitments, forming committees, and planning future actions. The children who had first spread the news of the koala rescue now led their own educational session, proudly sharing what they'd learned about wildlife protection. Their enthusiasm was contagious, drawing more families into discussions about conservation efforts. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the park, Jake found himself standing with Sarah at the edge of the crowd. "I didn't expect this," he admitted, watching as people continued to engage in serious conversations even as they began packing up. "When I first stopped to help that koala, I had no idea." Sarah nodded, understanding the unfinished thought. "That's how it usually happens," she replied. "Real change often starts with one small action." She paused, then added carefully, "You know, there's still so much more we could do here." Neither of them could have predicted how prophetic those words would prove to be, or how their newly formed alliance would soon be tested by forces larger than either of them had anticipated. The success of the event was just the beginning, a prelude to challenges that would require every bit of the community spirit they'd witnessed today. Dawn broke over the town square, revealing an unprecedented sight. Hundreds of bicycles gleamed in the early morning light, their riders dressed in matching white t-shirts emblazoned with the now famous image of the rescued koala. The community had embraced Sarah's idea of a bicycle caravan to the rehabilitation center with characteristic enthusiasm, transforming a simple transport operation into a powerful statement of solidarity. Jake adjusted his camera mount, preparing to document the journey. The sight before him was remarkable. Elderly couples on tandem bikes, children with training wheels decorated in ribbons, serious cyclists in professional gear, all united in purpose. Each rider wore the specially designed t-shirt that local artists had worked through the night to produce. "Quite a change from your solo ride a few days ago, isn't it?" Sarah approached, wheeling her own bicycle. She'd spent the morning organizing the riders into groups, ensuring safety measures were in place for the journey. Her usual field vest was covered by the same white t-shirt everyone else wore, though hers bore additional marks from her early morning visit to check on the koala's progress. The children who had first witnessed the rescue had been given a special position at the front of the caravan, their bikes decorated with handmade signs about wildlife protection. They took their responsibilities seriously, having memorized facts about koala conservation to share at rest stops along the way. "Everyone gather round," Sarah called out, her voice carrying across the square. The crowd assembled, a sea of white shirts and expectant faces. "The journey to the rehabilitation center is 20 kilometers. We'll make 2 stops along the way, and each stop will include an educational component about the wildlife corridors we're passing through. Remember, this isn't just about one koala. It's about understanding the ecosystem that connects us all." Jake watched as Sarah efficiently organized the group into formation. She'd planned the route carefully, choosing roads that would showcase the changing landscape and the environmental challenges facing the region. Local police had volunteered to escort the caravan, their vehicles marking the front and rear of the procession. As they prepared to depart, a journalist from the regional newspaper approached Jake. "Is it true you discovered the koala while on a cross-country cycling trip?" she asked, notepad ready. "What made you stop and help?" Jake hesitated, aware that Sarah was within earshot. "Sometimes the most important moments in life come when we least expect them," he answered carefully, avoiding details about his background. "This community showed me what it means to take action instead of just passing by." The caravan began moving with surprising coordination. The sound of hundreds of bicycle wheels spinning in unison created a gentle hum, accompanied by the occasional call of native birds. As they left the town limits, the landscape began to tell its own story. Patches of degraded habitat alternated with preserved areas, providing clear evidence of the environmental challenges Sarah had been documenting. At the first rest stop, Sarah gathered everyone around a viewpoint overlooking a valley. 10 years ago, she explained, pointing to a now barren stretch of land. This entire area was prime koala habitat. The trees you see remaining are like islands in a sea of development. When we rescue animals like our koala friend, we're seeing the direct impact of these changes. Jake noticed how the children hung on every word, their faces serious as they took in the reality of the situation. The same kids who had excitedly spread news of his discovery were now asking sophisticated questions about habitat preservation and wildlife corridors. The journey continued, with the caravan growing longer as people from neighboring properties joined along the route. Each participant had their own reason for being there. Some were longtime environmental activists, others were new to the cause, drawn in by the story of one rescued koala and a stranger who chose to help. Sarah rode beside Jake for much of the journey, pointing out significant landmarks and sharing stories of previous rescue operations. Her knowledge of the area was comprehensive, but Jake sensed there was more she wasn't saying, some larger concern weighing on her mind. As they approached the rehabilitation center, the caravan stretched out along the road like a white ribbon, visible from the surrounding hills. Staff members from the center had gathered outside, clearly moved by the show of community support. The sight of so many people coming together for wildlife conservation was unprecedented in the center's history. The building itself was modest, a converted farmhouse with several outbuildings modified for animal care. But today it seemed transformed, surrounded by hundreds of supporters and decorated with welcome banners made by local school children. The image was powerful, a small facility doing crucial work, now backed by an entire community's visible support. What no one in the celebratory crowd yet realized was that this massive show of community solidarity was about to become critically important. The rehabilitation center and everything it stood for would soon face a challenge that would require every bit of this newly forged unity to overcome. As Jake helped park bikes in the designated areas, he caught sight of Sarah standing slightly apart from the crowd, her expression troubled as she read something on her phone. The success of the caravan had been remarkable, but something in her posture suggested that bigger battles lay ahead, battles that would test not only the community's commitment, but also the growing bond between a wandering photographer and a dedicated biologist. The rehabilitation center's main treatment room fell silent as Dr. James Chun, the lead veterinarian, began his presentation. The space, usually reserved for animal care, now hosted a crowd of eager listeners still wearing their white koala t-shirts. The rescued koala, visible through an observation window, rested comfortably in a controlled environment habitat. What we're dealing with here is unfortunately becoming more common, Dr. Chen explained, gesturing to a series of medical charts displayed on a wall-mounted screen. Dehydration is just a symptom of a larger problem. The fragmentation of habitat forces these animals to travel across unsuitable terrain in search of food and water. Jake positioned himself near the back of the room, camera in hand but unused. Something about the gravity in the veterinarian's voice made him realize this wasn't a moment for documentation, but for understanding. The photographs of dehydrated and heat-stressed wildlife on display told a story more powerful than any he could capture. The koala you brought in, Dr. Chen continued, directing his words to Jake but speaking to the entire room, was lucky. But for every animal we rescue, there are dozens we never find in time. He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. The problem isn't just dehydration or habitat loss. It's the speed at which these changes are occurring. Animals can't adapt quickly enough to survive. Sarah stood near the front, her usual confident posture slightly diminished. She kept checking her phone, her face growing increasingly tense with each glance. When Dr. Chen opened the floor for questions, she remained uncharacteristically quiet, lost in thought. The tour continued through different sections of the facility. They saw the nursery where orphaned animals were hand-raised, the rehabilitation enclosures where recovering animals learned to forage again, and the research laboratory where staff tracked local wildlife populations. Each stop revealed another aspect of the center's crucial work. "We're operating at capacity," Dr. Chen admitted as they entered the research lab. "And that's not just about space. It's about resources, staff, and most importantly, time. The rate of animals needing intervention is increasing faster than our ability to help them." Jake found himself drawn to a wall of photographs, before and after shots of successfully rehabilitated animals. "How many of these were able to return to their original habitats?" he asked, noting the dates on the images. The question caused a visible shift in the room's atmosphere. Dr. Chin exchanged a glance with Sarah before responding. "That's becoming one of our biggest challenges. Even when we successfully rehabilitate an animal, finding suitable release sites is increasingly difficult. The areas these animals once called home are disappearing." It was then that Sarah finally stepped forward, her voice carrying a weight Jake hadn't heard before. "We need to tell them, James," she said to Dr. Chun. "They deserve to know what we're up against." Dr. Chin nodded solemnly. "The development project that's been proposed for this area isn't just another housing estate or shopping center," he began. "It's a comprehensive plan that would effectively isolate this facility from the remaining wildlife corridors. The property we're standing on right now would become an island in a sea of development." The news hit the room like a physical force. The earlier celebration of the koala's rescue suddenly felt hollow in the face of this larger threat. Sarah pulled up a map on her phone, projecting it onto the lab's main screen. Red lines marked the proposed development boundaries, showing how the rehabilitation center would be cut off from the very wildlife it was meant to serve. "The vote is scheduled for next month," Sarah explained, her voice steady despite the tension visible in her show. "Others, if approved, this development would not only destroy critical habitat, but it would make our work here virtually impossible. A rehabilitation center needs to be connected to release sites. We can't save animals if we have nowhere to return them to." Jake watched the faces around him as the reality of the situation sank in. The children who had led the bicycle caravan now pressed closer to their parents, their expressions shifting from excitement to concern. The community members who had celebrated their successful fundraising earlier now whispered among themselves, realizing that their efforts might need to be redirected toward a bigger fight. "But here's what they don't know." Jake spoke up suddenly, surprising himself as much as others. "They don't know about this community. They haven't seen what I've seen in the past few days. How quickly you can mobilize, how deeply you care, how effectively you can work together." Sarah looked at him with a mixture of surprise and gratitude. "Jake's right," she added, some of her usual confidence returning. "We're not just fighting for one koala or one rehabilitation center. We're fighting for the future of this entire ecosystem." As the group began to discuss potential strategies for opposing the development, Jake noticed something shift in the room's energy. The shock of the news was being replaced by determination. The same community spirit that had brought hundreds of people on bicycles to support one rescued koala was transforming into something more focused, more purposeful. What none of them realized yet was that the battle ahead would require more than just community spirit. It would demand sacrifices, reveal unexpected alliances, and force both Jake and Sarah to confront truths they'd been avoiding. The rehabilitation center had become ground zero for a fight that would test not only their commitment to wildlife conservation, but also their understanding of themselves and each other. The days following the rehabilitation center visit transformed the town into a hub of strategic activism. The community center, which had recently hosted their fundraising preparations, now resembled a campaign headquarters. Maps covered the walls, showing the proposed development areas marked in stark red against the existing wildlife corridors. Laptops lined folding tables as volunteers coordinated social media efforts and gathered signatures for petitions. Jake found himself applying his photography skills in ways he'd never imagined. Rather than capturing scenic landscapes for his travel blog, he was now documenting evidence of wildlife activity in the threatened areas. Each morning, he and Sarah would head out before dawn, tracking and photographing signs of koalas and other native species that would be displaced by the development. "Here's another scratch tree," Sarah called out, her voice carrying across the morning mist. She crouched by a large eucalyptus, pointing to distinctive claw marks. This is active koala territory. They've been using these trees for generations. Jake photographed the evidence, making sure to capture the GPS coordinates for their mapping project. The door-to-door campaign they'd organized revealed the complexity of the situation. Not everyone in town opposed the development. Some saw it as an opportunity for economic growth, new jobs, and modern amenities. Each house visit became a delicate balance of listening and educating. "I understand your concerns about employment," Sarah explained to a group of residents gathered in someone's living room. "But there are sustainable alternatives." She spread out their proposal for eco-tourism initiatives and wildlife research facilities that could provide long-term jobs without destroying critical habitat. Jake watched as she addressed each concern with patience and respect, even when faced with skepticism. The children who had been part of the original rescue continued to play a crucial role. They had formed their own environmental club, calling themselves the Koala Warriors. Their enthusiasm was infectious as they distributed informational flyers and shared what they'd learned about local wildlife with their families. "Mr. Jake," one of them called out during a community meeting, "can you teach us how to take pictures like yours? We want to show everyone what we're trying to save." This led to an impromptu photography workshop where Jake taught basic wildlife photography techniques to eager young environmentalists. As they worked together, Jake and Sarah found themselves sharing more than just campaign strategies. During late nights at the community center, over maps and marketing plans, their conversations deepened. Sarah spoke about her grandfather's legacy and her personal connection to the land. Jake listened, increasingly aware of how his own past had led him to this moment. "I never planned to stay in one place this long," Jake admitted one evening as they reviewed the day's photographs. "I've always been more comfortable passing through, observing from a distance." He paused, struggling with words that carried more weight than he intended. "But sometimes you find something worth fighting for." Sarah looked up from the maps she was studying, her expression thoughtful. "And sometimes the fight finds you," she responded. "When my grandfather started this work, people thought he was crazy. One person trying to protect a piece of land the developers saw as nothing but profit potential. But he understood something crucial, that everything is connected. The health of the koalas reflects the health of the entire ecosystem." The campaign gained momentum as they approached local businesses, building a coalition of support. Some shop owners offered their windows for displays of Jake's wildlife photographs. Others pledged to reject contracts with the development company. Each small victory strengthened the community's resolve. But it wasn't all progress. Late one afternoon, Sarah received a phone call that made her face darken. "They're moving up the timeline," she announced to the room of volunteers. "The development company is pushing for an earlier vote. They're trying to fast-track the approval process before we can organize effective opposition." The news galvanized the community. What had been a methodical campaign suddenly became a race against time. Jake found himself working alongside Sarah with renewed urgency, their shared purpose drawing them closer even as they focused on the task at hand. "There's something else," Sarah confided to Jake as they left the community center that evening. "I've been doing some research into the development company. Their environmental impact statements don't add up. There are inconsistencies in their data, but I can't prove it without access to their full reports." Jake felt a familiar tension in his chest, the kind that came with a decision point. He had skills from his past that could help access those reports, skills he'd been trying to leave behind. The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken questions. What neither of them realized was that their campaign was about to take an unexpected turn. The next phase would require more than just community support and environmental data. It would force both Jake and Sarah to confront truths about themselves and each other that could either strengthen their alliance or break it apart completely. As they parted ways that night, the setting sun cast long shadows across the town square. The same space that had recently filled with bicycle enthusiasts now held a different kind of energy, one of determination, urgency, and growing uncertainty about what sacrifices the coming fight might demand. The town hall had never been so crowded. People packed the historic building to its capacity, spilling out onto the steps outside, where volunteers had set up speakers to broadcast the proceedings. "The morning," Air crackled with tension as council members took their seats at the elevated platform, their faces showing the strain of the decision before them. Jake positioned himself near the back wall, camera ready but lowered. Through his lens, he documented every stage of their campaign: the community meetings, the wildlife surveys, the protest rallies. But today felt different. Today, everything they'd worked for hung in the balance. Sarah stood at the podium, her usual field clothes replaced by a professional suit that seemed to armor her for battle. Stacks of documents and environmental impact reports sat before her, representing months of research and community effort. The development company's representatives sat in the front row, their expressions carefully neutral as they reviewed their own presentations. Before we begin the formal proceedings, the council chairwoman announced, "I want to remind everyone that this vote will determine more than just the future of one development project. It will set a precedent for how our community balances progress with preservation." The developer's presentation came first. Their spokesman, dressed in an expensive suit that marked him as an outsider, painted an attractive picture of economic growth and modern amenities. "This development will bring over 300 jobs to your community," he promised, clicking through slides of architectural renderings. Shopping centers, luxury housing, entertainment facilities, all designed with minimal environmental impact. Jake watched the audience's reactions through his viewfinder. Some nodded appreciatively at the promises of economic opportunity. Others, wearing the now familiar Koala t-shirts, shook their heads at claims they knew to be false. The division in the room was palpable. When Sarah took the podium, her voice carried the weight of scientific authority mixed with personal passion. The environmental impact reports provided by the development company contain critical oversights, she began, pulling up her own slides. "Our wildlife surveys show that the proposed construction area serves as a vital corridor for not just koalas, but dozens of native species." The tension in the room mounted as Sarah presented their evidence. Jake's photographs appeared on the screen. Nocturnal animals caught on trail cameras, GPS-tagged maps showing wildlife movement patterns, before and after images of previously developed areas where animal populations had collapsed. "This isn't just about numbers on a page," Sarah continued, her voice steady despite the stakes. "This is about the future of our ecosystem. Once these corridors are broken, they cannot be restored. The rehabilitation center's work becomes meaningless if we destroy the very habitats these animals need to survive." The council members listened intently, taking notes and occasionally asking pointed questions to both sides. The development company's representatives grew increasingly uncomfortable as Sarah systematically dismantled their environmental impact claims. Then came the public comment period. One by one, community members approached the microphone. Shop owners spoke about alternative economic opportunities through ecotourism. Farmers described changes they'd observed in local wildlife patterns. Children from the Koala warriors read letters they'd written about their hopes for the future. Jake felt the familiar urge to remain invisible, to document without becoming part of the story. But when his name was called, he knew he couldn't stay silent. Walking to the podium, he felt the weight of every eye in the room. "I came to this town as a stranger," he began, his photographer's eye noting how the afternoon light streamed through the hall's high windows. "I had no stake in this community or its future. But what I've witnessed here, the dedication, the unity, the understanding that some things are worth fighting for, has shown me what real progress looks like." The development company's representative shuffled their papers, clearly unsettled by the personal testimonies. Their rebuttal focused on technical details and economic projections, but their earlier confidence had visibly eroded. As the council prepared to vote, Sarah returned to her seat in the front row. Jake caught her eye from across the room, seeing in her expression the same mix of hope and fear that he felt. The months of work, the countless hours of documentation and community organizing, all came down to this moment. The council members began their deliberations, their hushed discussions barely audible over the sound of held breath and racing hearts. The crowd inside and outside the hall waited in tense silence. Jake's camera captured the scene. Concerned faces, clasped hands, children perched on parents' shoulders, all unified in this moment of anticipation. What nobody in the hall yet realized was that the true test of their community's strength was still to come. The vote would prove to be just one battle in a larger war, one that would require even more from Jake and Sarah than they'd already given. As the council chairwoman picked up her gavel, the future hung in the balance, and the story was far from over. The council chamber erupted in murmurs as an unexpected figure approached the podium. Marcus Chun, CEO of Asia Pacific Sustainable Investments, hadn't appeared on any speaker list. His presence, announced just moments before the final vote, sent ripples of speculation through the crowd. Jake instinctively raised his camera, capturing the surprised expressions of the development company's representatives. Their previously composed facades cracked as they whispered urgently among themselves. Clearly, this wasn't part of their planned proceedings. Members of the council, residents of this community, Marcus began, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone used to being heard. I've spent the past month secretly observing this situation, and what I've seen has convinced me to take action. He paused, letting his words settle over the hushed room. My company is prepared to offer an alternative proposal. Sarah straightened in her seat, her eyes meeting Jake's across the room. This was an element they hadn't anticipated in any of their campaign planning sessions. The development company's representatives were now frantically typing on their phones, their discomfort visible to everyone. Marcus continued, clicking through a presentation that appeared on the main screen. We specialize in sustainable development projects that work with existing ecosystems, not against them. The images showed successful ecotourism projects from around the world, wildlife reserves that generated sustainable income while preserving critical habitats. What this community has demonstrated through its response to a single koala rescue is remarkable, Marcus said, nodding towards Sarah and Jake. It shows an understanding of something many communities never grasp, that economic prosperity and environmental preservation aren't opposing forces. They're interdependent. His proposal unfolded like a gift to the stunned audience. A world-class research facility that would expand the existing rehabilitation center. Ecotourism infrastructure that would create more jobs than the original development plan. Educational programs that would make the town a leader in environmental science. But most importantly, Marcus emphasized, our proposal maintains and enhances the wildlife corridors that make this region unique. We're not just preserving what exists, we're investing in its future. The financial projections he presented showed stronger long-term economic benefits than the original development plan. Where the other proposal promised quick profits through construction jobs and retail spaces, this alternative offered sustainable growth and international recognition. Sarah was called back to the pod, to address questions about how this new proposal would affect their wildlife conservation efforts. Her expertise, combined with Marcus's business acumen, created a compelling vision of what was possible when environmental and economic interests aligned. The research we've been conducting here, Sarah explained, her voice strong with renewed confidence, has global implications for wildlife conservation. With proper funding and facilities, we could become a model for other communities facing similar challenges. Jake watched through his viewfinder as the mood in the room shifted. The same community members who had been torn between economic necessity and environmental preservation now saw a path forward that didn't require choosing between them. The children of the Koala warriors were practically bouncing in their seats with excitement. Marcus addressed the council directly. My company is prepared to commit significant resources to this project immediately. We've already conducted preliminary feasibility studies, and we're confident in both the environmental and economic benefits. The development company's representatives requested a recess. Their earlier confidence completely eroded. When they returned, their spokesman attempted to discredit the new proposal, but his arguments felt hollow against the comprehensive plan Marcus had presented. In the gallery, Jake noticed something that as photographers I had been trained to see. The way people were sitting differently now, leaning forward, engaged, their expressions transformed from worry to hope. This wasn't just about stopping a harmful development anymore. It was about building something better. Sarah made her way through the crowd to where Jake stood. Did you know about this? She whispered, her eyes bright with cautious optimism. Jake shook his head, equally amazed by the turn of events. There's one more thing, Marcus announced, turning to address the entire room. We'd like to establish a permanent environmental oversight committee led by local experts. He looked directly at Sarah. We need people who understand both the science and the community. People who have demonstrated their commitment to finding sustainable solutions. The implications of this announcement rippled through the room. This wasn't just a business proposal. It was a blueprint for long-term change. The community that had come together to save one koala was being offered the chance to become a leader in wildlife conservation. As the council prepared to vote on this new proposal, the atmosphere in the room had transformed completely. The tension of conflict had been replaced by the electricity of possibility. But beneath the excitement, both Jake and Sarah sensed that this unexpected turn of events would demand more from them than they'd anticipated. Their eyes met across the crowded room, both recognizing that they stood at a crossroads. The future that was unfolding before them offered hope and opportunity, but it would also require commitments neither of them had planned to make. The true test of their dedication to this cause, and to each other, was just beginning. The sunset painted the rehabilitation center's grounds in golden light as Sarah led a small group through the newly approved expansion plans. 2 weeks had passed since Marcus Chin's intervention and the unanimous council vote in favor of the Sustainable Development Project. Construction markers dotted the landscape, but unlike the original development plan's harsh red warning signs, these marked the beginning of something hopeful. Sarah paused beside the koala enclosure, where their original rescued koala was making its final preparations for release. My grandfather used to say that every crisis contains an opportunity, she said, her voice carrying the weight of personal history. When he founded the center 30 years ago, people thought he was wasting his time. Now we're about to become 1F the leading wildlife research facilities in the Pacific. Jake stood at the back of the group, camera lowered, knowing he couldn't hide behind his lens any longer. The time had come for truth. As the tour group dispersed, he approached Sarah with purpose in his steps. Before we move forward with anything else, he began, there's something you need to know about me. His heart raced as he prepared to reveal what he'd been hiding. My real name isn't Jake Thompson. It's Jason Thorne. And until 6 months ago, I was a cybersecurity specialist for major development companies. Sarah's expression shifted as recognition dawned. Jason Thorne? The whistleblower who exposed the environmental data falsification scandal in Singapore. Jake nodded, relief and anxiety mixing in his chest. I discovered that development companies were systematically falsifying environmental impact data across Southeast Asia. When I tried to report it internally, they threatened me. So I went public, leaked everything to environmental watchdog groups. Then I ran. Understanding flooded Sarah's features as pieces fell into place. That's why you were cycling across Australia. You were hiding. At first, yes, Jake admitted. But then I found this place, saw that koala, met you. He gestured to the facility around them. For the first time since everything happened, I stopped running and started fighting again. Sarah was quiet for a moment, processing this revelation. Then, with a deep breath, she shared her own truth. My grandfather didn't just found this center, she said, leading Jake to a small office. From a drawer, she pulled out a worn journal. He was investigating the same development company that threatened you. His research, his documentation of their pattern of environmental destruction, it's all in here. She opened the journal, revealing meticulously documented evidence spanning decades. He died before he could publish his findings. I've been continuing his work, but I never had enough proof to stop them. Until you came along. The weight of their shared purpose settled between them. Jake's expertise in exposing corporate fraud and Sarah's lifetime of environmental research had unknowingly combined to create something powerful enough to attract Marcus Chin's attention. Marcus didn't just happen to find us, did he? Jake asked, realization dawning. Sarah shook her head. When our campaign started gaining attention, I sent my grandfather's research to his company. They'd been building a case against these developers for years. Your presence here, your photos, our community's response, it gave them the public narrative they needed to act. The setting sun cast long shadows through the office window as they sat with these revelations. Outside, the sounds of construction crews marking out the new research facility boundaries mingled with the calls of native birds returning to their evening roosts. "So what happens now?" Jake asked, finally voicing the question that had been hanging between them since the council vote. "The development company that threatened me hasn't given up. They'll look for other opportunities, other communities to exploit." Sarah smiled, a determined glint in her eye. "Now we do what my grandfather always dreamed of. We build something that can't be torn down. This center won't just be about rehabilitating individual animals anymore. It'll be about rehabilitating the way people think about development and conservation." She pulled out the plans for the new facility. Marcus's company isn't just funding buildings. They're funding a network of similar centers across the Pacific. We'll be the first, the model for others to follow. And we need people who understand both the environmental science and the corporate threats we're facing. The invitation in her words was clear. Jake looked down at his camera, then out at the land that had transformed him from a solitary observer into an active participant in something larger than himself. "Running was easy," he said finally, hiding behind a camera lens, "moving on before anything could touch me. But sometimes the hardest journey is the one that leads you home." As they stepped outside, the community center's lights were visible in the distance, where another meeting of the Koala warriors was taking place. The children who had first spread news of a rescued koala were now part of something that would shape their future and the future of countless communities facing similar battles. The koala that had brought them together watched from its enclosure, healthy and strong, ready for release back into a habitat that would now be protected for generations to come. Like the animal they had saved, both Jake and Sarah had found something they thought they'd lost. He had found his courage to stand and fight. She had found a way to fulfill her grandfather's legacy. Together, they had discovered that some journeys end exactly where they need to begin,